I want to show you a couple of pruning pictures that I came across when I was driving around. So this is a beautiful, would have been a beautiful coast live oak, but it was planted too close to the house. And so they decided, I guess the thing to do is prune it away from the house. This is an olive tree. Now it would be, what would be even, I mean, I could maybe understand if you had a fondness for bonsai and it was in your yard, but this was actually like way out in the middle of a field. And could not quite understand why someone was torturing this tree in this way. I call this my hockey puck picture. Some people, I don't have any idea what kind of tree this is. But can you guess? Say it again.
Is it one called topiary?
This could be called topiary if they were trying to make a specific design. You know, usually topiary is a little more artful. In this case, I think it's a little bit more, well, sure, they're trying to make a gumdrop here. Okay, so what kind of tree do you think this is? Can't really tell, can you? A mushroom tree. All right, so these actually are redwood trees. And if you look in the same property, it's a commercial property in San Jose, if you look, they probably planted these redwood trees at exactly the same time, but only pruned the ones in the front. And so you can see that this one is starting to head for the hills again. You see this, these branches coming straight out the top and trying to regain their redwoodness. Sometimes we plant things too close to the valve that we need to access. And then over time, this happens. This is the natural shape of an asparagus fern. And this was a gas station I pulled into, and I'm like, some people just should not be allowed to have pruning shears. And somebody asked about Japanese maples. So Japanese maples are known for their beautiful planier growth, and people specialize in pruning maples. And sometimes you can bring certain trees back after they've been damaged by pruning, but I'm fairly certain there is no way to resuscitate these trees. For one thing, they have two trunks or three trunks or even four trunks that are far too close together. And then of course all this hedging going on in the front. So you would probably have to just take these out and start over with new trees and a new pruning person. So I want to talk a little bit about tools. So there are two basic types of pruning shears. One is called a bypass, and they work like a scissors in that the two blades cross each other, but it's different from a scissors also in that you only sharpen one blade, one of the blades. And you sharpen that blade on only one of its sides so that you never end up with a gap between these. This is my favorite kind of pruners. The other kind of pruner is called an anvil pruner, and the blade actually hits against a flat thing. So they tend to crush the material. I'm not even sure why anvil pruners exist because they aren't as good, but they are cheaper. It's kind of important to know that to clean your blade, you can do it very simply. This is what I keep in my pruning kit, is just some foaming bathroom cleanser. And the reason is because your blade is likely to get a lot of goo on it. And so if you just use some of this, you can clean off all the goo, the sap and whatnot. but at the same time it sterilizes the blade because there's some bleach in that. And I find this the simplest thing you can do for keeping your blades clean. And if you are doing something very specialized where you're pruning something and you know you have a diseased wood that you don't want to spread, for instance, when you're cutting fire blight out of pears, which is very common, then you should really have a bleach water solution and dip your blade each time. And then, of course, you want to oil the blade because you don't want it to get rusty. Say that again? How often do you clean them? Oh, I have to say I'm not very good at, she's asking how often I clean my blades. Not very often. Not as often as I should. I would say when it's getting gunky, then you would want to do something like that. Yeah. Okay. Yes?
Me sometimes use the lighter. Does that work too?
Oh, that's interesting. So he's saying he sometimes uses a lighter, which will... So what you're trying to do is to remove the... you're trying to sterilize the blade, I assume. Okay. Yeah. It's fine. Don't set your bushes on fire. Yeah. Oops. So there are many, many brands. I personally like Felco. I actually have my original Felco pruners that I had in college, which is amazing, and they still work, and all the parts can be replaced. So if you, and they have a lot of different kinds. They have some for left-handed people. They have some that swivel if you have a little bit of difficulty with your hands, etc. And Corona is a good brand too. Too fast. Loppers come in the same bypass and anvil types. And I highly recommend this if you do any kind of pruning or gathering of fruit that's just a little bit out of your reach. I really love this Ars long reach cut and hold pruners. I think that's the only brand that makes them. You can buy them online, and they extend, but they act just like a pruning shears on a stick. But even better, they have a feature that when you close them, they hold the fruit and you can bring it down. Like keeps you from when you're picking your pomegranates or persimmons up high, you can just bring them down to you instead of dropping them on the ground and crushing them. So, yes? So what she's saying is that Felco has a bunch of numbers, like Felco 2 and Felco 4 and Felco 20, I don't know. It has a lot to do with how big they are, how strong they are. You can see the difference. If you look online, you'll see the difference in pruners. And maybe the best thing is to go someplace and try them in your hand, because that's what counts, is how it feels in your hand. Pruning saws also are really helpful. They cut on the pull, unlike a regular saw. I like these folding saws. And what else can I say about that? Honestly, I am not absolutely sure, but I think that is possibly a way to sharpen your saw. I'm not really sure. I even have it there. I also like some of the Japanese pruners, like Silky and some of the others. They're very sharp, and I've never had to sharpen them. They just stay sharp. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. All right, let's talk a little bit about proper pruning cuts. It's kind of important to hold your pruners so that you'll have this sharp blade. You'll have this sharp blade on the top. You can see it right here in this picture here where it says right. And that's because then you'll get a little bit closer to the inside of the branch. And you won't leave a stub, which is, as we will find out, a no-no. Also, on the cutting the edges, if you starting from the left, from the right, if you cut it too high over the bud, then you're going to have this whole area which will dry out or rot. And then if you cut it too sharply so the bud is exposed, then the bud might completely be exposed and dry out. And so this is an actual proper way to cut a bud and keep the bud from dying. Because you're cutting back to a bud, that's a thinning cut, as I said, and you're wanting that bud to then sprout. Sometimes it's called breaking. You want that bud to break or sprout, and that goes in a certain direction. Yeah, so what happens here, if you think about, she's asking, why do I say this bud is exposed? So if you make a very steep cut, very close to this node or this bud, then there's all this area that's going to dry out, because that's now you've exposed the inside of the sap to the air. And then it'll dry out, and very possibly this bud will die. So that's all. You just want to, sometimes it doesn't matter, because you're just making a lot of pruning cuts, but sometimes it does matter, and you want that particular bud to sprout in that particular direction. So now I'm going to talk about some specialized pruning techniques. So one of them is shearing and hedging, and you use that on small leaved plants, and we saw some bad examples of shearing and hedging, but it still is a realistic pruning technique for certain things. Selective size reduction. This is something that most people want when they are pruning. They're wanting their shrubs and trees to be smaller. So coppicing, we said, was to the ground. Cane growers, there's a very specific way that you would prune a cane grower. And of course, we want to know how to prune grasses, and also pinching. I know there's a lot of question about when to prune. So here's something important to know. Pruning will stimulate growth. It just depends when and where that growth is going to happen. So with trees that lose their leaves, in other words, deciduous trees, they lose their leaves in the winter. If it's easier to prune them then, because you can see where you're cutting, right? The leaves are not there, so you can actually see what's going on. But winter pruning will invigorate and direct growth into everything that you leave, because that tree still has the same amount of roots and the same ability to grow quite a lot. Say it's going to grow X, but now it's only going to go into a certain number of those branches because some of those branches were removed. Now, summer pruning dwarfs the plant. That's interesting. What does that mean? So instead of making your plant taller and more directed, in summer you are removing leaves. That means you are removing the capability of that plant to photosynthesize in the moment. So the more leaves you remove, the less photosynthesis can happen and the more dwarfing happens. Now, eventually it grows out of it, right? But if you are pruning in the summer, you are dwarfing, and if you're pruning in the winter, you're invigorating. I hope that's clear. Anybody really confused about that? Just remember that photosynthesis is the way plants grow. They're in the sun, they're through the miracle of photosynthesis and chlorophyll and all that, they are growing that way, actively growing. And when you reduce their ability to photosynthesize, you make them, it isn't that you're making them suffer, but you are definitely reducing their ability to grow. It's like making your mouth shut so you can't eat as much, like that. Yes?
So the best time I have some apricots and I have some nectar like this size, the best time to prune them is in the summer.
So he's asking specifically about apricots, and that's not the first question I've had about apricots. So I want to say that apricots are a little different in that they have a disease that they will get if you prune them in the winter. They are more susceptible to having rain splash that brown rot around on all the cuts. So the best time to prune an apricot is in the dry season. So anytime after you harvest the fruit until it rains is the best time to prune apricots. So when they still have leaves, they are sort of one of the exceptions to the rule, and it is because of brown rot And we have a long dry season in which would be a good time to prune them. And obviously you don't want to prune them before the fruit comes off, so you want to wait till after the fruit. I'm sorry.
I have nectarines too.
Nectarines are different. Hang on, yes.
So is it a good rule of thumb that if you want to top a tree and to make it a little smaller, you should do it in the summer?
Okay, so what she's saying is, if you want to top a tree and make it smaller, would it be better to do it in the summer? So, except for the fact that I don't want you to top your tree, yes. So if you're doing a fruit tree, let me talk about how you can reduce the size without actually hacking it off, okay? And so, let's see. Yeah, there's always a lot to say about fruit trees because everybody's sort of like, I have 5 different kinds of fruit trees and you have to treat all of them differently, and that is confusing. So perennials and shrubs, obviously since you want them to bloom, you're going to prune after the bloom, but early bloomers, those would be things that bloomed on wood that was produced last year. You would prune after, so those you would prune after they bloom, give them a chance to grow some new wood, and that is the wood they're going to bloom on in the next year. Summer bloomers, they will bloom on new growth. So the more you prune them, the more they grow, the more they're going to bloom on that new growth. You can prune those in the spring, so that's fine. It is important sometimes not to prune right before it freezes. Like right now, isn't it going to freeze this week? I'm pretty sure it is. So you don't want to prune right before frost because any tender new growth is going to be more susceptible to being frozen and damaged than foliage that is hardened off. And I have some examples of that. Tip pinching, sorry. So tip pinching is a great way to keep things sort of compact or bushy, and you can just use your fingertips as you walk around your garden. You can just go all that soft new growth. Every time you kind of pinch it, it's going to sprout 2 branches wherever you tip pinch it, because it will branch off on the side. And so if you want something very compact and bushy, think like a deer. Like when the deer are browsing, they're like, they just munch a little bit and then they move on to the next thing. And that's kind of what you're going to do. And of course, you want to prune with sharp tools. That's an important thing. All right, shearing. So hedges that have small leaves and very close internodes, in other words, the leaves are close to each other. They are usually plants that will shear well and respond well to shearing by making lots more little, like a boxwood would. So you make the base larger at the top. This is a pet peeve of mine. I often see hedges, I'm not even sure why, narrower at the base than at the top. And I think it has something to do with when you're holding out the shears or something, I'm not sure. But even professionals sometimes make mistakes. But the base should be larger than the top because you can avoid shading out the bottom that way. And it also looks better. I mean, it looks more solid, like the base is not going to tip over or anything like that. This is a picture of an overpruned hedge. I really don't think this one's ever going to come back. Sometimes, you can hope it comes back, but there are certain species that will not recuperate from this. There are some that will, and those are generally the things that can respond to coppicing. But this is an evergreen that is just not going to respond well.
Is Pittosporum one that will recover?
Pittosporum can be cut back. Yes, Pittosporum is one that will recover. So there are some plants, and I highly recommend them, that really use very minimal pruning. And one of the important things when you have a plant like that is don't plant it so close to where it, think about how big it's going to grow. So if you don't plant it too close to your sidewalk or your window or another tree or something like that, then it should fit in the space as it grows. Certain plants like that would be ceanothus, a manzanita, coffee berries, Indian hawthorn. They have a natural, beautiful shape that you don't have to mess with if you give them enough space. Here's an example of Yankee Point, California lilac. This is a ceanothus, or if you spoke Greek, ceanothus. Anyway, this is a plant that makes a beautiful tall ground cover, bright green, evergreen, has blue flowers in the spring. It's California native, needs very little water. And if you don't plant it too close to anything, it can grow 8 to 12 feet wide. And if you don't plant it, 3 feet from if you don't plant it in a little parking strip, you should be fine. If you do plant it in an inappropriate place and you have to cut the sides, it will grow taller and taller and taller. So it won't be quite the ground cover that you imagined. There also are plants that heavy pruning is okay. So here are a few. Coyote bush, the dwarf coyote bush, you can cut it pretty much close to the ground to refresh it and it comes right back. California fuchsia, I actually brought one, so I'll show you. And I just want to remind you that afterwards I'm going to be raffling off all the plants up here. This is a California fuchsia. I don't know if you can really see it well, but it has beautiful orange flowers and hummingbirds love it. And it blooms all in the late part of the summer, all the way until frost. And to refresh it, you just cut it to the ground. So that's a good thing for that. Also, Matilaha poppy is another one that you can just cut to the ground every year if you want to take the time. In the winter, yeah. In the winter, you would cut it right to the ground, and then it would just start to refresh for spring. This is an example of cutting a coyote bush right very close to the ground, and it is going to refresh that woody shrub. And as I said, only certain species can handle that. Like a ceanothus would not like to be cut to the ground, but a coyote bush can certainly do it. It's not really with the intention of keeping it small. This is really more if it got woody, if it's not as pretty anymore, if it has some brown branches in it, then you're refreshing it. Because remember, it's not really it's gonna grow out to its full size again, Things wanna grow to be their mature size. That is just the truth of it. So try and pick the right plant in the first place. This is an example of dwarf coyote bush used as a ground cover to, it's great for erosion control. And so that's just a picture. Another plant that can really be coppiced back is oleander, right? So oleanders sometimes get very huge and kind of funky, but if you cut them down, they sprout right back. They have huge, tremendous root systems, and so they will just respond to that by growing right back and then blooming like crazy. This is a picture of the Matilaha poppy I mentioned. This is also one that grows very tall and looks better, I think, if you cut it back every couple of years. When I was in college, they had a lot of them at UC Davis in the Arboretum, and I remember my professor telling me at the time, "Oh, just run a tractor over it." If I had one, I probably will. I planted 3 of these in 1 gallons on my property in different places, and they now cover, I don't know, each one covers about 20 feet. They spread by runners. They're not for a small yard. Another pruning technique that we want to talk about was espaliering. So espaliering is that pruning a plant flat in 2 dimensions. So it's not difficult, by the way. They look very formal, it's very interesting. It only really requires consistency. Basically, what you do is you just cut off anything that is growing in the wrong direction. I mean, anything that grows flat, you leave it. Anything that grows out towards you, away from the fence, you cut that off. And you have to do that about 3 times a year because it can't get away from you because they want to. They want to grow where they want to grow. You can take certain things and just if the plant has a limber branch, you can tie it back against the fence, like a raspberry or blackberry or something, if you want to keep it flat. Apples and pears espalier very well because they fruit always at the same place on the plant. Someone mentioned nectarines earlier, and I want to say that nectarines fruit on brand new wood. So you prune nectarines very heavily because you want to get lots of new branching, and all that new branching will have flowers, will have fruit, and peaches and nectarines are the same thing. However, apples are not like that. You basically prune apples a little bit because the more of that fruiting wood, those little spurs that you cut off, the less fruit you get. So be aware that how they grow is very differently. Oranges are a different matter altogether, and somebody mentioned, how do you prune citrus? I rarely prune citrus at all. As far as I'm concerned, they make a nice shape. If you give them enough space, they really don't need much pruning at all. They, yeah, that's my thought about citrus. If you have planted them too close to a house or something like that, yes, you're going to have to, try and unearth your house from your tree. If your tree is too large for the space, let's talk about tree topping. So tree topping really does harm a tree. It offers places for infection. It doesn't really work because every time you cut a branch, maybe 2 or 4 branches come from that same place, and you end up having this hydra effect, right? So you've cut this big branches off, and now all these sprouts come, and the tree's going to be just the same size as it was in a couple of years, so you don't really do anything except injure the tree. So proper size reduction takes very consistent, forever maintenance. So this is why you want to pick your tree carefully before you plant it. Pollarding looks like this. It kind of looks like tree topping, but it's much more skillful. And only a few trees are actually suited to it. So these are sycamore trees. You've probably seen these in the circle in Golden Gate Park near the pavilion, the Shell Pavilion in Golden Gate Park. They have all these beautiful trees. It's a very formal look. Basically, they're not cutting the big branches. They're cutting this little growth off every single year, and then they end up having these sort of knobby parts, but you don't have big cuts. It's smaller cuts. I don't love this technique, by the way, and people who use this on everything are using a lack of understanding about how trees really do grow. Okay, let's talk about pruning trees when they're young. All right, so when you buy a new fruit tree, first of all, I want to say, yes? Why do people want to pollard trees? That is a good question. I do not know the answer. I'm talking about a regular person. In terms of this old traditional technique that was done for centuries, it was a way to keep trees in a very formal look and to keep the size a certain amount. Also, you get a lot of very dense shade very quickly, like on a fruitless mulberry. They will just shoot out with 12 feet of branches within a very short time. That's all I can think. Okay, let's see. When you buy a brand new fruit tree, and it is it's bare root or it's in a pot, and it's a deciduous fruit tree. I'm not talking about citrus now. I'm talking about pears, apples, peaches, plums, any of those. You're going to buy it in the winter, preferably, because you'll get a better selection. And you will, let's see, and it might be this tall. I mean, it might be this tall. It might not be, but it'll be pretty tall. But you don't really want your fruit tree to be that tall. In orchards, yes, because they hire pickers and they have great big ladders. But in your yard, you don't want that. You want a short tree that you can stand on the ground and pick the fruit there, right? That's how I want my fruit trees. And so when you get this tree, say it's a persimmon or a pomegranate or something, you're going to do something very radical when you buy it. You're going to look at your knee, which is what, 18 inches off the ground, and you're going to cut that tree off right there. And you will do exactly what everybody just did. Oh, no! And the reason you do that is so that all the branches that are going to hold all the other branches that will hold the fruit will start low. You don't need to walk under your fruit tree. You need to be able to walk around it to pick it. That's my thought. This is a technique that is not at all like what commercial people do, but this is a technique for backyard fruit. You want a little multi-branch tree, so you don't have to get on a ladder, because we don't want to get on ladders anymore. Yeah.
So it's better to buy them when they're short?
No. Well, she's saying, is it better to buy them when they're short? Not necessarily. You can buy them when they're short, but that also means that they're young. You can buy one that has a trunk that is like this, maybe 3/4 of an inch or an inch, and it'll probably be as tall as I am, but you're going to shape it the way you want it to grow, and that's why you cut it off at knee height, because then it will branch right there. Yeah.
So you buy the tree
Yeah.
as is.
You plant it. First plant it. Plant it first.
You chop it off at 18 inches.
Yeah.
How tall will it?
How tall will it grow?
Yeah.
Totally depends on what kind of tree it is, and also what it has been grafted on, because a lot of fruit trees have been grafted onto a dwarfing rootstock. And if they aren't, then they're going to still want to be 40-foot trees, but nobody really needs a 40-foot tree.
Let's say you plant like semi-dwarf apple and pears.
Okay, so semi-dwarf apple and pears. You should be aware that even semi-dwarf fruit trees may grow to be 20 feet tall. They might be. It depends on what kind of rootstock they have. So a lot of times they will have a label and it will tell you what kind of rootstock it is. It'll say Miralbalan plum or something. You can look that up and you can find out how much that actually dwarfs.
What about citrus?
I'm not going to talk about citrus right yet. Don't get me confused. But I can in a moment. Mostly I want to talk about deciduous fruit trees. Somebody else back there want a question? Oh yeah, we'll turn that back down so you can see this. Did I want to say something else? Oh yes. So then when you're shaping your fruit tree, you want to, as those, say, 4 branches grow, you want to select branches that go in different directions so they're not all on the same side of the tree, right? And I want to, tell you a few things that you would want to do. Yes?
Well, we didn't cut the tree down
Yeah.
last year when we bought it. Do I need to,
Can you do it now?
I'm 2 years old now. Am I supposed to cut it down to my knee?
No, if you've already had it in the ground a while, I wouldn't necessarily cut it to your knee, but I would look carefully at where the branches are and where it is branching. And if your tree is branching substantially up above your head, I would consider cutting it lower. If you have some lower branches, that's good. That's what you want. You want some lower branches.
It's too bad because I just cut off.
You know what? Thank you for saying that, because what she said was, darn, I just cut off all the lower branches. And that is because we have an image of a fruit tree that comes from our orchard heritage, that fruit trees you should be able to walk under, trees you should walk under. But in the case of backyard fruit trees, it's a little bit different. And there's a whole lot of information on the internet about backyard orchard growing, and you can get lots of information about it. I mean, it expands to even growing 3 in a hole and just different things. But I just want you to be aware of that as a practice. Now I want to talk to you about some of the other things you can do about pruning and shaping a tree. If you have two branches coming off the same side, and they're only 4 or 5 inches apart, think, what are they going to look like in 10 years? Each one of those branches is now going to be wider, and they're going to be right next to each other. So you'll have 2 branches in the same plane, and you don't need that. So pick the best one and remove the other one. Think, how is that tree going to look in 10 or 15 years? You want those side branches to be nice and thick. You want them to be at a good angle. This is another thing. You want to avoid narrow crotch angles. So tree branches that branch like this, over time, will push each other apart and split. So you don't want that narrow crotch angle. Does everybody understand what I mean by a narrow crotch angle? Anybody not? Because I can expound. Yes, out there. Okay, so in the back. So when you have 2 branches coming off, and I'll just use this as a demonstration because you can kind of see it in the light. These are kind of narrow crotch angles. Like, see, if these 2 branches were really close to each other, but they kind of grew up narrowly like this, that when those 2 branches grow bigger, they are going to push each other apart because of all the bark between them. And then eventually they might split apart during a windstorm or something, which would be bad for you and bad for the tree. So the better branch angle is one that is more horizontal off of the trunk, like this, at a horizontal angle, not a narrow vertical angle. So the more horizontal branching, by the way, are also stronger branches, and they also are branches that produce more fruit sooner. Vertical upright growth is vigorous vegetative growth. It is not going to produce fruit right away. It will produce fruit if you bring those vertical branches up to horizontal. Then it's all about hormones. Once again, the hormones will then go towards fruit production instead of vigorous leaf production. Oh, what a great question. She said, can you hang heavy things on it? I always do. I have fishing weights in my box. I have loose, I don't tie it tightly because you don't want to girdle the tree, but I hang little, I take those little bags that onions come in and shallots come in, and I fill those with rocks and I hang them from trees like this, and it looks like Christmas, you know, has come early, but I'm trying to bring those branches down to horizontal. The branches I want. Yes? So a weeping fruit tree is a whole different shape. You're not trying to, I mean, you want it to have the beautiful weeping shape. So you leave that. You prune for that weeping shape. You don't want low branches on a weeping tree. That's a completely different thing. Thank you for asking. Yes? Does it apply to what? So she's asking about fig trees. Fig trees branch like crazy. They will branch with lower branches no matter what you do. So it doesn't really matter. You don't really have to cut them off. Usually you buy them very short anyway. When you buy them, they are very short. But they will do a natural suckering of many branches. And a lot of figs, probably all figs, are not grafted. They are grown on their own rootstock anyway. So they have a natural shape. You can play with those. You can cut those all you want, and they will just keep coming back. Next question.
So does this also apply to flowering trees that are not fruit trees?
Okay, thank you. She's asking, does this also apply to flowering trees that are not fruit trees? Not exactly, because you are not wanting the same thing out of a flowering tree than a fruit tree. You don't have to pick the flowers from a flowering cherry or something. So it's fine for a flowering cherry to have a single trunk and a large canopy. You don't want to cut those off because you don't want that to be a shrub, flowering shrub. You want it to be a flowering, so the answer is no, you treat it very differently. And I am spending a bit of time on fruit, but I also want to let you know that narrow crotch angles aren't good on any kind of a tree because they will potentially be occluded with bark and split later. Here's an interesting thing. So you said that you cut off all the branches on the trunk, and I want to encourage you to leave some branches on the trunk, not just on fruit trees so you can have lower branches, but because branches on the trunk make the tree grow faster. So leaving some branches on the trunk, but not long branches, just you can cut them back to a foot long or something. Leaving some leaves around the trunk will help the tree grow faster and be more healthy. So here we have a tree with lots of branches on the trunk, and some people would think, oh, just strip all those off and just leave a little canopy on the top. But it would be better, where's my pruning shears? It would be better if you want this tree to grow faster, to cut all these branches on the trunk that are small, just tip them, just remove them a little bit so that they don't compete with the leader, but they still provide some leafy growth on the trunk, because these leaves are going to translocate photosynthates right to that trunk and make the trunk bigger faster. When you take these off, if you want a tree that just has a straight trunk and a canopy, which is something that we want sometimes. If you want that, you leave these all here on the trunk. Just keep cutting them back until they are, and here's the rule of thumb, when the side branch is 1/2 the size of the trunk, you remove it. You don't want it to get bigger than half the size of the trunk. Like these little things, they can stay on a couple of years, but once they start to be half the size of the trunk, just take them off, okay? Yeah, you would do it with at that point, you'd be doing it with a pruning cut, like so. Yes? So if you don't leave a stump, you won't get regrowth. And a certain amount of regrowth is okay, because you're just trying to build up the trunk, taper and caliper. While I'm on the subject of trees, which let me make sure I have enough time to cover everything. While I'm on the subject of trees, I want to say that this tree doesn't need to be staked. It has already a lot of limber, caliper. It has been growing in the breeze. But when you buy a new tree, you need to stake it because it's been growing in the nursery. It doesn't have a big root. It doesn't have a big root system. You should stake it, but you should stake it so the trunk still flexes. And the reason is the more that trunk flexes like it does naturally, the better taper you'll have, and that tree will not break. It actually will grow a little shorter if it can flex than if it is straight-jacketed next to a stake. And that's why you see proper staking has 2 stakes and some rubber ties, and it's loose, and it allows the tree to move around without breaking. Once the tree is as big as your stake, you can take those stakes off. A lot of people forget that. So flex is important to develop the taper, which keeps the tree from breaking. Okay, let's see, more things. Thinning cuts, not heading cuts. Okay, let's talk about some of those pictures. So in the first picture up above, you see that there's a lot of branches, and some of those branches are next to each other in the same plane, and that's why you remove one of them and you leave the other one, because remember, we want enough space between those branches so that they don't interfere with each other later. You don't want them to duplicate each other's, you don't want them to be in each other's space. You want them to go in different directions off the tree, unless you're doing espalier. And this is an example of heading back where you're actually cutting it way back. The only time I'm really recommending heading back is when you first buy that fruit tree, isn't it? That's a severe heading back, because what you want is a lot of options coming from that. Thinning out is where you would cut back to a side branch or a bud, and that allows the tree to develop more growth out further. So this is the difference. Remember, we talked about a weak or a narrow crotch angle, this is a narrow crotch angle. This is a strong, wide angle crotch right there. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Always, when you prune it, always we have to leave like a leader.
Always we have to do what?
I think that was the leader, the top.
Oh, no. He's asking, do you always leave a leader? No, you don't always leave a leader because sometimes you want more of a vase-shaped tree. A lot of fruit trees are more vase-shaped. They don't have a single leader. So it's just be aware that some trees have a very strong desire to have a leader. And so you might have to work with that. Pruning, yes?
We moved to a new version house, which has a very big orange tree, which is really too high.
Ah,
But I'm really afraid to cut it down.
Yeah.
Because if I, maybe I'll kill
so what she's saying is they moved to a house that has a very large, mature orange tree, and they're afraid to cut it down. You know, you can do some size reduction on an established, very older citrus by making thinning cuts. You go in and you cut out certain branches only, but you want to, with a mature tree, like I'm going to talk about mature trees. When you want to do mature trees, you want to make sure you're not cutting back too much in any 1 year. You should do it over at least 3 years. Cut back by a bit, like less than a third the first year, less than a third the second year, less than, so you're cutting it back and directing it. With citrus, you can do that. You should do that in the summer after the fruit comes out. Well, fruit comes off in the winter. But you're going to do it in the summer to reduce the size, the photosynthetic issue. And you might want to hire a professional because it's a big tree and you want it to survive. All right, so what you're wanting to do when you do premature trees is I think you want to enhance the natural shape and not end up with a weird shape. You sometimes want to open up where it's very dense and dark in there. You might want to open it up, and that means some thinning cuts where you're bringing out a branch out of the center or something like that. A coat hanger is a stub, something you could hang a coat hanger on, or hang a coat on. Don't leave stubs, because that is where the tree will have a difficult time healing. So let's explain how trees heal. So when you cut off a branch, like a big branch, and you cut it off, say, 8-10 inches out here, and you leave this stub, that tree can always heal itself. They have something called compartmentalization. They're going to let that dead part die, and then the living part is going to very slowly creep over and cover it. You've seen this happen if you have ever looked at trees that looks like they have eyes. It's because the callus, the living wood, has come over to cover up the injury. And so if it has to cover up, if it just comes this way, suppose you cut it here, it only has to cover, this much. But if you cut it way out here, it has to creep all the way over here and cover this whole area, and that takes a long time, and it's just harder on the tree. It might not ever make it, so it'll have an open wound for a long time. I wanted to talk about branch collars. Yes?
Is there any way to fix a tree that has had that happen?
You have a big stub? Yeah, cut it off. Yeah, because you're going to cut it back to close to living wood, and allow that living wood to come over and callus over. It's just like we have scabs if we cut ourselves, If it has lots of little growth coming off of where it got cut. If it's really disfigured, suppose you have a big stub that somebody hacked it off, and it has a lot of branchy stuff coming off of it, and and that's not a desirable thing, just cut that branch off. Smooth, relatively smooth. Now I'm going to tell you what I mean by relatively smooth. So we talked about branch collars. See this little lump here at the bottom of the branch? And we're talking about mature trees now. You'll see this on a branch. This is special tissue. This is the tissue you don't want to cut into, because this is the tissue that will protect the tree. So you want to cut close to in the center of the crotch, but at a little bit of an angle here, so that this branch collar is not cut into. If you're not careful and you're cutting without making a saw cut at the bottom, the weight of the tree will cause this entire thing to rip right down the tree, and that cuts it, that tears into the branch collar, and that kind of wrecks it. Makes it very hard for it to heal. Contrary to common belief, you don't have to put tar or paint or anything over a wound on a tree. It will heal itself if all else is normal. So this is a dead branch that needs to be cut off, and then this living part will cover it from the branch collar. This is a living branch that's going to be cut off. Maybe it's going too close to the house or over a sidewalk. Then you just cut it at slightly an angle to not cut into the branch collar. Any questions? I assume that was clear then. Yes? So she's asking, when you cut a few inches from the base, from the bottom of the branch, does it sometimes send out suckers or water sprouts or yes, sometime depending on the kind of tree it is. But then you would just deal with those. So once again, it's best if you don't try and reduce the size through pruning, and you can hire a certified arborist. I do want to urge you, when you hire someone to work on your property, to hire someone who is licensed, someone who is not just wandering around saying things like, I'm working over at your neighbor's house. I have a little bit of extra time. I can help you out here. You know, still do your due diligence, because you can damage your trees terribly. I have heard some horror stories. All right. We're going to move on to talking about cane growers. So cane growers are bushes, woody plants that they have multiple stems from the base. And you can see this is a nandina here. It doesn't show up as brightly as it should, but this is a nandina, and the other plant, I'm not even sure what that is. Can't even tell. But you can see that a lot of branches come from the base. With these, the best pruning technique is not to just cut them at the top, but to reach down, all the way down, take the ugliest branch and reach all the way down and cut it at the base. And then you look at the next ugliest branch that's in the wrong place, or it's kind of woody and it doesn't have a lot of branches, and you go all the way down to the base and cut that one off. And you just step back. Pruning is always it's always a process. Cut, look, cut, look, sip, cut, look. Anyway, no. Anyway, I think that this is how you should prune a cane grower, because it makes more branches come from the base, and those are the ones that will have more new leaves, which is what the look you want. Here's an example of a cane grower, a Ladybank's rose, that I saw at a Kaiser parking lot, and they obviously did not know they were planting a 15, 20-foot cane grower in this parking lot, because it was making these long canes coming out into the parking lot. Now, the only benefit of this is it doesn't have thorns. But they just kept trying to prune it, and it just was never going to be the right plant for that space. It's a cane grower. Grasses. Grasses are tricky, yeah.
I have a question before we move forward on that process. I have one something like that. I use my shears on it. Is the right way to use it?
Say it again.
I
You're
have the
shearing
same-
it?
Yeah, I have the same type of these roses. I have small.
Is it okay, so he's asking about a rose question. I'm not particularly a rosarian, but I'll do my best. So you have some kind of rose
The same thing like
that looks like that has long canes. Okay, so
I use shears instead of use.
So he's saying use shears. No, actually with that one, with that Ladybank's rose, you should probably allow it to grow tall and cut it from the base. So wherever there's a branch that's coming out the wrong way, cut it off at the base. New ones will come from the base, and I've seen Ladybank's roses over trellises, on fences. They are not short roses. They're great big roses. They need to be espaliered or pruned, or to be tall. Otherwise you're fighting nature all the time. Okay, grasses. So with evergreen grasses, grasses that really are not deciduous, they don't turn all brown, completely brown in the winter. What I like to do is groom them from the base. They are growing in the middle, like this is a deer grass. They're growing in the middle. Those brown stems are actually the flowers. It's not brown, it's perfectly evergreen, you just can't tell. So from underneath, I usually put on good gloves, or I use a pruning shears, and I just start to pull out the dead leaves underneath, and that refreshes it because all the new growth is coming from the center. And also, I just really have a dislike of butched over grasses. I just think that they look awful for quite a while. Sometimes you have to, and for deciduous grasses you do, but for these you really don't. Oops, this is, let me get, so in these grasses, you would prune them back in the winter, and you can use a steel rake, you can do different things. Here's a technique that on these deer grasses, which are very big grasses, they grow about 5 feet wide. This one we actually pruned from all the base, which is where all the dead leaves are. And it ended up looking kind of surprised, but then it relaxes. So it ends up, being a natural form, which is really what we're looking for, is a natural form. Yes?
I have to ask a question about the flowers of this grass.
Yeah.
You don't ever cut off?
So I don't usually cut the flowers off of this grass. I think it's very architectural, but, and so I leave it. But every so often, you might get kind of tired of this, and then you can cut the whole thing. Yeah. This is another grass. This is another evergreen grass, Berkeley sedge. It's actually a carex, and it's also can be treated the same way. It grows from the center and stays evergreen from the center, but all the dead thatch is at the base. And so you can kind of lift it up and groom it away using even your hands or your shears if you prefer. This is a picture of that same exact picture after a haircut. So, and then you can see that it refreshes and comes back. That particular person was cutting it back, yeah.
So I'm confused, do you want to leave them like this?
So this is a,
Years and years?
oh.
Or do you want to cut them back to the?
Yes, so this is what I would do. Part of it is because I'm lazy. I would leave them in a more natural form for a couple of years and then refresh. Yeah. So, yeah, this person did refresh annually, but I don't at my house. Periodically, and also I don't water, but so they don't grow very fast. But I just groom them when they start to look shabby at the bottom and take that dead thatch off and compost it. So deciduous grasses like purple fountain grass are a different matter in that they turn completely brown and they're pretty big, so you really do have to cut them all the way back after, in the winter for them to look good, for them, all the new growth is going to come out, and you won't be able to see the new growth very well if you don't prune them every year. I'm going to talk about perennials. And we did talk about tip pinching already. That's particularly useful for things like chrysanthemums while they're actively growing. If you tip, they will become bushier and not fall over as much. Deadheading will encourage reflowering in many plants, not every plant. For instance, a plant that really only has one bloom a year, like a narcissus, is not going to rebloom that year if you cut off the flower. But plants that have a lot of flowers will often bloom better if you take off the seed heads, and that's what you're doing when you are deadheading. I am going to talk about division as one of the propagation techniques, but that's another thing that you would do. And then certain perennials need to just be cut back in the fall or winter because they're going to regrow very quickly from the center if you do that. And if you don't cut them back, they will grow from the tips. And then they'll end up with a big brown spot in the middle, and lavenders are a typical example of that. Deadheading. In fact, maybe while I'm talking about lavenders, maybe I'll do a quick demonstration with lavenders, because I bet a lot of people here have lavender, yes? And you're not always sure what to do with it. How about some light? We'll do a quick demonstration. Kevin, can I have some light? Yes. Okay. So I brought a lavender because I wanted to demonstrate this, and I just thought this is a very commonly grown Mediterranean plant in California and elsewhere. Yes, but I can't prune it up here, but I will do my best. Okay, lavender, very common plant. There are a lot of different kinds of lavenders, as you know. There is English lavender, Spanish lavender, French lavender, lavender crosses, dwarf lavenders, big lavenders. This particular one is an English lavender called Lavandula angustifolia, and it is going to grow about 4 feet wide and maybe about 3 feet tall. It will have long stems. We'll have long stems of flowers on it in the summer, and then they will turn brown. The whole plant smells good. It's drought tolerant. If you water them too much, they will be short-lived, just saying. Okay. The first thing you do at the end of the season is cut the flowers off. Okay? So you just cut the flowers off. This one already had them removed. So the flowers will be probably another third as large. And you just cut all the flowers off. Okay, that's the first step. Second step is cut your lavender back by 1/3. Just 1/3. So that will refresh it, and it doesn't decimate it. You're not cutting it to the ground. So you figure 1/3 is, is going to be here. So you're going to be cutting off 1/3 all the way around. That's what you're going to do. This is kind of a heading cut, I have to admit. But we're not talking about trees anymore. So you're just going to be cutting it off. And it has a lot of internodes very close together. So they are going to be... there are so many buds here that I am cutting to buds without even trying. Yeah, there are so many buds. You don't have to be super careful with this because of that. So I'm cutting to, I'm just going to do 1/3, 1/3, all the way around. And this is one of those cases where the tallest thing looks the most suspicious. So you just cutting it back, and this is you're gonna have this ready for regrowing now, and it won't end up having a great big brown spot in the middle. So this is admittedly a pretty young plant, and it's a lot more work when you're working on a 4-foot plant. And you would do this in the fall or even in the winter, but before it starts to resprout. And if we have a very mild winter, it might start resprouting quite soon. And you want it to resprout all along here and not at the tips. So that's the main thing. I mean, it will grow from the top, but you don't want it to only grow from very long tops. So that is how you do it. And later on, when we do our propagation techniques, I will show you how to make cuttings out of all these things. Yeah?
How often do you cut back the lavender? Do you do that every year?
Once a year.
And what if you still have, it's still flowering, it's still...
Well, okay, so that's a great question. What do you do when it's sort of time to prune it, but it's still flowering? Roses will do this. If we were in the East Coast, they would know it was winter. But they don't. So you sometimes you just have to go, okay, this is the time. I'm sorry, we're cutting you back. Okay, that was a little aside on lavenders. Okay, we can have the lights back again. Thank you. All right. Deadheading. So, come along. It doesn't want to move now. Okay, I'm going to need some technical help because I can't get it to move forward. I may have inadvertently turned it off, but I just need the next slide. Yes?
I have that tree, I don't know the name of it.
This one or this one? This one. Yeah.
That has flowers.
Yeah.
It's overgrown.
Yeah.
I don't know how to
Quick question about salvia, Gregi. Sometimes the species that you might have as hot lips, that's a really popular one that has red and white flowers in each flower. But this is one of those kind of blobby bushes. It's never going to have form. It's never going to have shape like, say, a manzanita would have, which would have branching and, you know, different possibilities for being a structural plant. This is going to be what I would call sort of a subshrub. You know, it doesn't really have, it's not really woody, but it's more, it's a large perennial, and you're going to do a lot of pruning on it just like I did with the lavender, only you can be a little more severe with this one. If yours is already overgrown, they grow 6-8 feet wide sometimes. Go at it. Just go at it. You don't have to be particularly careful.
Is this the right time to?
Thank you. So she's asking, when is the right time to do those? So in the case of these guys, they bloom nearly year-round. So you're going to just have to sort of pick a time. I would ordinarily say after the bloom, but the main thing you don't really want to do is you don't want to cause a lot of soft new growth right before frost. So I wouldn't do it right this minute. I would do it in either earlier or later, just not right near frost time. Okay, so deadheading. This is a picture of a California native sulfur buckwheat, and all the flower, it was a beautiful flower. Yellow flowers, dwarf plant, gorgeous flower, perfect for pollinators and butterflies, and then afterwards the flowers turn brown and it's not so pretty. So we're going to deadhead it, not so much so it'll bloom, but more for attractive appearance. And so this one, we're removing the dead flowers here, and then you see the plant again, right? I left, well, I didn't do this, actually, Stephanie Morris did, but this little edge is just, it isn't quite completely done, but you can see the edge of flowers. There's another flower that is lovely, woolly golden aster, and in the upper picture, it bloomed like crazy with solid yellow flowers, but then the dead flowers don't look that great. Those are actually the seed heads on it. And so what I usually do is I take my hand like this and I just brush it off really vigorously, and then all the seeds fly away and you're left with these little bright stars. And I think that's so much easier than actually getting down there and cutting every flower off. And it effectively refreshes the look.
They eventually fall off on the ground.
Eventually. So what happens next isn't that they fall off, it's that the new growth will be just a little bit taller and cover it. So you won't see that next year. Yes?
So do you recommend cutting it back in the winter?
No, I don't usually cut Heterotheca back in the winter at all. I think they have a very nice compact growth habit, and so, you know, they are not going to get very tall. They'll just get a little wider, so I don't cut them back at all. If you have a rangy plant that's a different species, yes, then you would do that. Yes?
How about monkey flower?
Monkey flowers. Oh, yes. Okay. Monkey flower. So this is a monkey flower. I brought a monkey flower because they're in bloom and they're beautiful, and I thought I would like to introduce you to monkey flower. They come in different colors. They are California native, and they're a little tricky in some ways to grow in that they have a summer dormancy period looking like crap. Okay, so they get very dry looking in the summer. That would be the time after the bloom to cut them back by about a third, kind of shear them a bit, and then give them some water because they actually will appreciate some monthly water, and then they'll rebloom for you. And that's what I would do with the monkey flower. Their best season really is in the winter. Winter, spring, fall, not in the summer. Yeah?
I have a question about salvia, the
Mexican, I'm going to get to that. So you don't, hang on, I will get to the Mexican sage. So chrysanthemums. You buy those chrysanthemums, they have been forced They are beautiful. You buy them in the nursery. They're blooming already, but they were forced because chrysanthemums don't bloom with long day length. They bloom with short day length, hormones again. And so what they do in the nursery is they pull great big black tarps over them to make them think it's short days, and then they bloom. And you buy it in the pot, and it's great and gorgeous, and then you put it in your garden after it blooms, and then all of a sudden it's 3 feet long and laying down, because they also used growth hormones to make them short and bushy like that. So to make them bushy again, do a lot of this tip pinching while they're growing, and then they won't be so long and lanky. You're pinching the end off, which does remove it. Oh, that's a great question, and thank you for asking that. Yeah, it's not like you're pinching a baby. You're actually removing the tip. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because as a horticulturist, I kind of get into the jargon. Yeah.
If you already have a chrysanthemum planted and it's growing really big,
Yeah.
can you just cut it down?
Okay, so she's asking, what if you already planted that chrysanthemum? I love these after the question. Oh, I already planted it. It's already 3 feet tall. No, you don't want to cut it back now, because now that it's short day length, it's blooming. It's not going to bloom again until next fall. So no, just stake it. Just stake it or lay it down, one or the other.
And you never will cut it.
Oh, you're going to cut it back after it blooms. Cut it to the ground. Yep. This is one you cut to the ground to refresh it from the base. Yeah. And next year, pinch, pinch, pinch. California fuchsia, that is one I already told you need to cut it to the ground. It was the one with the red flowers that hummingbirds like. That one you cut to the fall. In the winter, you cut it down to the ground. I don't know if you know sedum autumn joy, but that is another one that it's a succulent that blooms. It's very popular, I guess, on the East Coast. And you'll see this new growth coming from the base. And that's a sign that you should just cut all the top part off. And here is a chrysanthemum that if you don't cut it back, you'll see all the branches have died and all the new growth is coming from the base anyway. So take your tip from that. Cut off the dead part, or cut it off before it dies like that. Somebody asked about Mexican sage. Yes, question?
Do you cut this California fuchsia before it's still flowering?
Aha. So she asks, do you cut California fuchsia before it finishes flowering? Do it sometime in the winter. Do it sometime in the winter. There are going to be a few flowers left. You can wait yet. It's just that we've had a very warm late summer and they're still blooming. But if they're starting to get really rain, and the hummingbirds still are going to them, so it's kind of nice to have them. Yeah, just wait until, you can wait a little bit more, or you can do it now. It just depends how tidy you are. You know, so somebody asked me about Mexican sage. This is one which you also need to prune annually to really refresh it, or it ends up being a humongous large bush with a lot of dead branches on it. But you can see that this is what it would look like if you didn't prune it. It will have last year's branches all kind of turning brown, and all the new growth is coming from the base anyway. But don't cut it back until all danger of frost is over. And the reason is that these dead branches are serving as frost protection for the new growth. Mexican sage comes from Mexico. It's warmer there. It doesn't freeze. And so this, like other plants that we have borrowed from other places, some of them don't have the same frost ability to withstand frost. So yeah, you would wait until all danger of frost is over, and that would probably be I used to say March 1st, but probably by February now it's going to be, we used to say April 1st, but global warming has hit us. Yes? Oh, thank you for asking. Coyote mint and coyote bush are two different plants completely. Coyote bush is not, it has a very undescript flower. It's not very showy. Coyote mint has a big purple bloom. So they're not the same plant at all. They're both California natives though. So coyote mint, I wouldn't cut it back as severely as you can cut back, as I told you, you can cut back coyote bush. But coyote mint, the Latin name is Monardella. That one I would cut back like a lavender about a third. If you wanted to refresh it.
Mexican sage, if you're pruning it, do you just prune the plants that are flowered, the stems that are flowered?
Correct.
Or everything?
So what you're doing when you're pruning the Mexican sage, remember I said because it's frost tender, you're going to wait until spring. You're not going to cut the green part off. That's the new growth. You leave that. You just cut off all the dead branches that were last year's growth. Yeah. Any other questions about this? Because we're going to take a break soon. Yes?
Prune the pineapple sage is same like Mexican sage?
Pineapple sage is not the same. It is not as frost tender. So pineapple sage is another a plant that you can cut back to shape it, you know, but you don't have to cut the whole thing back. Yes? Hydrangeas. Okay, so hydrangeas bloom on, okay, I have not grown hydrangeas because they are water loving and I really have focused a lot of my career on things that were drought tolerant. However, I do know a few things about hydrangeas. And one of them is that they bloom, don't they bloom on old wood or new wood? Which is it? That's really the secret. Who knows?
It's old wood because there are two techniques.
Yeah.
My Japanese gardener
Mhm.
always cuts it all the way to the
Uh-huh.
top, and then this year it didn't bloom at all.
Got it. Okay, so hydrangeas, according to our expert here, hydrangeas bloom on old wood, and you'll see kind of the buds as the leaves fall off. You'll see that. If you cut that off, you can cut that all the way to the ground, and you will not get any flowers the next year. You will not get flowers the next year if you cut it to the ground. So what you're wanting to do is prioritize some of that old wood, and so you're going to prune that somewhat in the summer, allowing it to grow again before the fall, and that part will get a chance to make some buds that you'll get some flowers on. I hope that's correct. Yes? Oh, verbena. So there is a California native called Verbena lilacina de la Mina, Cedros Island verbena. And so you're asking what to do with it. Okay, so it's another one of those plants that I would call a blobby plant. It has lots of flowers. It blooms for at least 6 months out of the year, and it has lots of flowers. And it blooms on new wood, new leaves. So you can cut it back pretty dramatically, and then it should just refresh like crazy. And so because it is a Cedros Island verbena, and it is a little frost tender, so I wouldn't cut it back in the winter because of the same reason for this guy. So I would cut it back after it blooms in the late summer and give it a chance to harden off a bit before that, or do it in the spring, either one. Yeah.
Do you treat Russian sage the same as Mexican?
Russian sage is a little different from Mexican sage because the Russians have frost. So it's okay. No, I'm not sure. I'm being silly. Russian sage. Russian sage I would treat more like the English Russian sage. Perovskia. You're talking about Perovskia. Sorry. Russian sage is a deciduous plant.
Oh, that's not dying then.
Oh, I love that. I said, it's a deciduous plant. She goes, oh, it's not dying then. So which is great. Yeah, it's not dying. It's deciduous. So yeah, you're going to cut it back hard after, and then in the spring it will refresh. Okay, so we're going to take a break, at least 20 minutes, I'd say. Let's see, right now it's 10:36. And so we'll take a break, bathrooms, look at material on the table, and come and look at the plants, and enjoy.
And again, housekeeping, bathrooms are through the door. There's Ada's Cafe, and you have to leave early. Please fill out this survey and give us any feedback. And then a little house announcement too. Again, there's a home efficiency genie for Palo Alto residents. On the back side, these are helpful tips for the season. So remember, we're getting into winter, so dial back your irrigation, as well as some other tips on saving on energy and water. We also have our annual group buy for solar. So if you register by the end of this month, you're still eligible for that. So we have some of this information in the back if you guys have any questions.
Okay, we're going to take our seats. And I realized that I had one more pruning demonstration I wanted to share with you. So listen up. So have your seats. And what I wanted to do is give you an example and a demonstration of how to take a bigger bush, like a pittosporum or a camellia or something that has a lot of branches like this, and make it smaller without making it square or round. In other words, to keep its natural shape. And these aren't the best examples, but I'm going to do a word description as well as sharing with you how to do it. So you're going to take your here's your bush. And say it's just too big, it's starting to hang over the path or something like that. You're going to take the longest branch, the one that sticks out the furthest, and you're going to reach your hand in, deep in, and cut it back there, deep inside. And then you're going to take the next longest branch, and you're going to reach your hand in deep and cut it back. And then you're going to go and you're going to stand back again, and you're going to look at the next longest branch and reach in deep and cut it back. And you keep doing that, and anytime it looks really bald, you go, oops, and then you back off. But basically, if you do that, you can take and cut things back by a couple of feet, and you can't tell. Nobody can tell that you just did that. So you're reaching in and taking the longest one out as far in as you can reach. And you're making a thinning cut as usual. A thinning cut would be, for example, to another branch or a bud. So that's a thinning cut. A heading cut is like this, okay? So this is a really helpful technique for things that grow kind of, they're woody shrubs, and they won't look good if you hedge them because they have big leaves or something like that. So what you can do also, suppose they're very floppy, like a sage that's floppy and has started to spread out across the ground. Then reach down with your hands and lift it up. Cut the bottom part off and lay it down again. Do it again and again. Lift it up. Lift it up, cut all the lower parts off, and then allow the top part to fall down and cover the part you cut. And it will look smaller, but still natural, and no one will know you cut it if you do it right. Basically, questions about size reduction using that technique. I think it's a very effective technique for pittosporums, for anything that's kind of woody like that, that's just gotten a little bit too big. Okay, I've got a bunch of stuff here to throw away. Yes?
One more question about pruning. What about raspberries and blackberries?
So raspberries and blackberries are a little bit different things in that raspberries are cane growers. They're both cane growers. So in theory, you're supposed to be taking out raspberry canes the second year. So you have a lot of basil shoots coming up. They bloom, they fruit, and that branch you take out, and then you have the fresh one, and so they bloom the second year. So you're always taking about half of it out. And if you don't take it out, they will just die, and then you can just snap them off. But I actually saw blackberries you can actually trellis, quite long, and so you don't have to take them out. You can actually just trellis them on a fence or something. But I also heard that you could cut those raspberries all to the ground and basically have two crops, have two beds, cut one to the ground this year and this one next year, you know. But I didn't ever find that worked that well. So I never liked to do that.
Excuse me, what if
Yes.
you want to encourage growth at the bottom of a privet hedge?
Okay, so she's saying, what if you want to encourage growth at the bottom of a privet hedge? So, they do regrow quite well from the base. So the more you cut that back, the more they're going to, and this is actually a privet here. So remember I had that one long limber one that had apical dominance, you know, but this one was cut back, and you can see that the side branches are all starting to come now because the top was cut off. So you can do that, and if you want to encourage new growth on a privet hedge, for instance, every one of these leaves has a bud right above the leaf. And every one of those, and you can see them on the stem, you can see those buds. And if you were to cut to here, pretty sure these buds are going to sprout. Privets are pretty strong. So wherever you cut, that's where the new branch is going to come. And I think I also didn't mention this, but you want to direct the growth in the direction you want to go. So you don't want a branch to go back into the center of the tree. So when you're pruning, suppose I want a nice branch out towards you, then I would probably cut this off, and I'd cut this off, and now this new branch is going to come towards you. And I could also know that even if there was just a bud, I know which direction that bud is going to go. It's going to go away from the tree branch, and so I can create the shape of the tree I want that way. Okay,